It was one of those mornings when the airport seemed to breathe on its own. Alive with the sounds of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and people trying to rush from one place to another while pretending they were calm. The sun had just risen, and its warm light spilled through the glass walls of the terminal, painting everything gold. Most travelers didn't notice the beauty. They were too busy checking the time, checking their tickets, checking their kids. But one person did notice the little boy walking beside his father. The boy held a small toy plane in his hand, the wings slightly chipped from years of play. He lifted it now and then, making it glide in the air as he hummed softly. His father walked next to him, carrying 2 backpacks. One belonged to him. The smaller one, decorated with clouds and stars, belonged to the boy. They were running a bit late for their flight, not because they overslept, but because the boy insisted on watching a real plane take off from the viewing deck before going to the gate. His father, patient but aware of time, allowed it. 5 minutes only, he had said, but the boy's excited face made it hard to rush him. He always tried to give his son small moments of joy, especially during trips, because the boy didn't have many people in his life besides him. Now, they were moving quickly toward the gate. Weaving through the streams of travelers, the father checked the signs, trying to keep a steady pace without making the boy feel guilty for the delay. He reminded him gently, "Hold my hand. Stay close." The boy nodded and held on tightly. As they reached the final turn toward the gate, the crowd suddenly thickened. A group of passengers had stopped right in front of the boarding area, waiting for the announcement. In the middle of them stood a pilot in full uniform, tall, strict-looking, and completely focused on his tablet. His face was serious, the kind of expression that made people step aside on instinct. The boy, shorter than everyone around him, didn't see the pilot. He only saw an opening in the crowd where he thought he could walk faster. He slipped forward, trying to make his way through, and bumped right into the pilot's leg. It wasn't hard. It wasn't aggressive. It was the kind of small bump any child makes in a busy place. But the pilot reacted as though something far worse had happened. He looked down sharply, eyes narrowing. "Hey, watch it," he snapped, his voice loud enough to make several people turn. The boy froze. He hadn't expected yelling. He stepped back and looked up with wide, startled eyes. His father came forward instantly. "I'm sorry, sir. He didn't see you." "It was an accident." He placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. The pilot wasn't satisfied. He straightened, puffing his chest slightly as if trying to assert authority. "This is a restricted area for crew movement. You don't let your kid run around like that. Someone could get hurt." The father kept his voice soft. "He wasn't running. He just bumped accidentally. No harm done." The pilot scoffed. "No harm done? I don't have time for careless behavior. If he can't control himself, maybe you should keep him away from the boarding zone." The boy's eyes filled with embarrassment. He lowered his head, holding his toy plane tight. His father's heart tightened at the sight. A gate agent, noticing the tension, stepped closer. "Sir, everything okay here?" she asked the pilot. The pilot gestured toward the boy. "This child just ran into me. I don't have time for disruptions before a flight. Security needs to know when people don't follow rules." The father tried once more to calm things. "Please, we're just passengers. We're boarding this flight. There's no need to escalate anything." The pilot shook his head. "I'll decide that," pulled out his radio and spoke into it more loudly than necessary, as if wanting everyone to hear. "Requesting security assistance at gate B27. Possible disruption." People around them started whispering. Some looked annoyed. Some looked curious. A few took out their phones. Though they hadn't started recording yet, the boy tugged his father's sleeve, whispering, "Did I do something bad?" His father knelt so he could look him in the eyes. "No, you just bumped someone. It happens. You didn't do anything wrong." But even as he reassured his son, frustration and disbelief grew inside him. How could a grown man, a pilot, no less, react so harshly to an innocent child? They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, 2 airport police officers approached, their expression serious but controlled. The crowd parted for them, all eyes on the small family. One officer spoke calmly. "We got a call about an incident. Can someone explain what happened?" The pilot stepped forward quickly, eager to control the story. "This boy charged into me and caused a disturbance. I'm preparing for a flight, and I can't deal with this kind of behavior. I want them checked before boarding." The officer turned to the father. "Sir, is that accurate?" The father held his son close. "My son bumped into him. That's all. He wasn't running or causing trouble. It was an accident." The pilot overreacted. The second officer looked at the boy, who was standing silently, clutching his toy. "Did you run into him, kiddo?" he asked gently. The boy shook his head. "I didn't run. I just walked and didn't see him. There was nothing threatening about the child, not his posture, not his voice, not his behavior." But the pilot crossed his arms as if still expecting them to be removed. More passengers gathered. Some whispered things like, "Poor kid," or "Why is this such a big deal?" Others simply watched, curious about where the situation would go. The officers exchanged a glance. They knew this wasn't the kind of issue that required police involvement. But since the call was made, they had to follow protocol. "Sir," the first officer said to the father, "can we see your ID?" "Of course," the father replied. He reached into his bag calmly and handed it over. The officer took the ID, looked at it, then paused. His expression shifted. He looked again, more carefully this time. Then he looked up at the father in a different way, more respectful, more aware. He stepped closer and said softly, "Sir, would you mind stepping aside for a moment?" "Just you." The father nodded. "My son stays with me." "Of course," the officer agreed. "Both of you can come." The pilot looked annoyed, as if he felt the officers were taking too long to deal with something he considered serious. "Are we done here?" he asked impatiently. "I need to prepare for takeoff." The second officer turned to him. "We'll handle it. Please wait." His tone was polite but firm. That only made the pilot more irritated. He muttered something under his breath but stayed where he was. Shifting his weight from one foot to the other, the officer led the father and son a few steps away from the crowd. Not far, just enough for some privacy. He lowered his voice. "Sir," he said carefully, "I recognize your name. Is this really you?" The father nodded calmly. "Yes." The officer exhaled slowly, almost in disbelief. His tone softened immediately. "I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding. We'll take care of this." The father shook his head slightly. "Please don't make it bigger than it already is. My son is scared." "I don't want any attention." "I understand," the officer replied. But the pilot shouldn't have escalated this. Meanwhile, the boy looked up at his dad. "Are we in trouble?" His father brushed his hair gently. "No, we're fine. Everything is going to be okay." But even as he said that, he could feel the eyes of the crowd on them. He could feel the pilot's frustration from a distance, and he knew things were only beginning to unfold. The officer stood with the father and his son a short distance from the gate, where the boy kept holding his toy plane close to his chest. He didn't understand fully what was happening, but he could sense the heaviness around him. His father tried to give him a calm smile, but even the boy could see it was forced. The officer, who recognized the father, kept his voice low as people nearby continued to steal glances. "Sir, please understand," he said softly. "We're required to respond when a crew member calls us. But from what I can see, there was no threat at all. It was just a misunderstanding." The father nodded. "I know you're doing your job. I'm not upset with you," he spoke gently, with a tone that made the officer feel even more embarrassed about the situation. The boy pressed closer to his father's side. "Are we still going on the plane?" he whispered. "Yes," his father reassured him. "We will. Don't worry." But the boy didn't look fully convinced. His eyes wandered toward the pilot, who was now pacing near the gate, clearly irritated. The pilot kept checking his watch and looking toward them as if expecting the officers to return with some sort of report. The second officer returned from a brief conversation with the gate agent. "The flight hasn't started boarding yet," he said, "so you're fine. We just want to make sure everything is clear before we head back." The first officer nodded. "Sir, would you mind explaining what happened from your point of view, just so we can officially close the call?" The father took a small breath, keeping his voice steady. We were walking to the gate. The crowd was thick. My son stepped forward, trying to move through an opening, and bumped into the pilot. It wasn't intentional. He didn't run or push. He just didn't see him. The officer wrote a few notes. No disrespectful behavior. No aggressive action. The father shook his head. None. The boy tugged his sleeve again. Dad, he whispered. The father gently knelt to his height. What is it? I really didn't do it on purpose, the boy whispered. I know, his father said softly. You didn't do anything wrong. The officer watched the exchange, realizing again how unnecessarily the whole situation had grown. The child wasn't loud, disrespectful, or wild. He was simply a kid navigating a crowded place. When they finished the questions, the officer handed back the father's ID. Thank you, sir. We're very sorry your son was frightened by all of this. Before the father could reply, the pilot walked over with forceful steps. Are you done? He asked sharply. Some of us have flights to operate. The officer straightened. We're finishing up. The pilot's eyes moved to the father, but instead of softening, they remained firm. I hope you understand, he said, trying to sound authoritative. This is a professional environment. People can't just let their children cause trouble. The father met his eyes calmly. My son didn't cause trouble. He bumped into you by accident. That's what you're saying, the pilot replied. It's the truth, the father said. Keeping his tone even, the officer stepped closer. Sir, he addressed the pilot, we handled the call. There was no threat. Everything is clear. The pilot didn't seem satisfied. He looked frustrated that the officers weren't backing his version of the story. His jaw tensed, as if he were holding back more complaints. Passengers nearby watched silently, trying to understand who was right and who was wrong. Most had already guessed the truth from the child's frightened posture. The pilot didn't walk away yet. He hovered, as though expecting the officers to change their minds. I just want to make sure, he said loudly, that we're not letting anyone on board who could cause issues mid-flight. Safety comes first. The boy looked confused. I won't do anything on the plane, he whispered to his father. I know you won't. The father reassured him. The officer broke the tension with a practical tone. Sir, everything is resolved. If you need to return to your pre-flight duties, please do so. We'll finish up here. The pilot hesitated, then turned away with a stiff walk, muttering something the passengers couldn't hear. Once he was a few steps away, the second officer shook his head slightly. Some people take their authority too far, he murmured. The father said nothing. He didn't want to escalate anything further, especially not in front of his son. The officers thanked him again and stepped back, heading toward the security post near the corner. They kept glancing over their shoulders, maybe still feeling the weight of who they had just encountered. The father took a slow breath and patted his son's back. You okay? The boy nodded, though his voice came out small. Will the pilot be mad at us on the plane? He'll be busy flying, the father said gently. And even if he's upset, that's his problem, not yours. The boy leaned against him, slowly calming down. After a few minutes, the gate agent approached with an apologetic expression. Sir, I saw what happened, and I just want to say I'm sorry you had to go through that. Your son didn't seem out of control at all. Thank you, the father replied kindly. I appreciate you saying that. We're still preparing the cabin, she continued softly. But as soon as boarding begins, you and your son can come first if you'd like. Just to avoid more stress. The boy looked up hopefully. Can we? His father smiled. If she's offering, then yes. The gate agent smiled at the child. Of course. You two deserve a peaceful start. She walked back to her counter, preparing documents as passengers continued gathering. The father sat down with his son in the nearby seating area. The boy placed his toy plane on his lap and ran his finger along its wing. Dad, said after a moment, why did the pilot get so angry? Sometimes adults forget how to be patient, the father replied, especially when they feel stressed or important. Do you think he doesn't like kids? The boy asked. I don't know, the father said honestly. But what matters is that you didn't do anything wrong. The boy nodded slowly, but still seemed troubled. Soon, the airport announcement system crackled with a boarding call for another flight. The sound made the boy look toward the window, where planes of different sizes were being pushed back from the gates. Engines hummed, luggage trucks rolled by, and lights blinked beneath the morning sky. The boy watched with renewed interest. Forgetting for a moment the stress he had just faced, his father watched him quietly, grateful for anything that could distract him from the earlier fear. After several minutes, one of the officers returned not to question them, but simply to check in. "Everything okay here?" he asked kindly. "Yes," the father said. "Thank you." The boy gave a small wave. "Hi." The officer smiled at him. "You doing all right now?" The boy nodded. "I was scared earlier." "I know," the officer said softly. "But you're safe, and you're a brave kid." The boy sat up a little straighter. "Really? Really?" The officer winked and looked at the father. "We'll stick around the gate area for a bit, just in case anything else happens. But I don't think you'll have any more trouble." The father nodded gratefully. "Thanks for that." The officer gave them one more reassuring nod before heading back toward the security post. The boy leaned closer to his father. "Dad, who did he think you were?" The father paused. He hadn't planned to talk about it yet, not here, not now. "It's nothing important," he said gently. "But the officer talked to you different after he saw your ID. That's just grown-up things," the father replied. The boy studied his face for a moment but didn't ask again. He trusted his father enough to let the topic rest. More passengers arrived at the gate, joining the growing group waiting to board. Some of them glanced at the father and son with curious eyes, clearly wondering what had happened earlier, but none approached or made them uncomfortable. The pilot, however, did return to the gate area. He checked something on the screen, talked briefly to another crew member, and then glanced toward the father and his son. His expression was unreadable, part annoyance, part something else. He didn't walk toward them, but he didn't stay far. He seemed to be waiting for some sign that he had been justified. The father ignored him. When the gate agent finally picked up the microphone, she smiled in their direction before speaking. "We will begin boarding in a few minutes," she announced. "We appreciate your patience. Pre-boarding will be called shortly." The boy squeezed his father's hand excitedly. "That means us, right?" "Yes," his father said. "We'll go when she calls." But before boarding could start, another airport staff member arrived, someone in a suit, someone clearly in a higher position. He approached the gate agent, whispered something, then turned his eyes toward the father. Then he began walking straight toward them. The boy leaned closer. "Dad, why is he coming here?" The father didn't answer right away. He had a feeling he knew why. Everything that had happened so far was only the beginning. The airport official approaching the father and son walked with a calm but purposeful stride, the kind that told everyone nearby that he wasn't just another staff member doing routine work. His suit was neatly pressed, his badge clipped cleanly to the front of his coat, and his expression held a seriousness that made people instinctively step aside. Even the gate agent straightened. When she noticed him approaching the small family, the boy watched him nervously and held tighter onto his father's hand. His toy plane dangled from his other hand, the nose pointing downward like it felt the tension too. When the official reached them, he offered a polite nod. "Sir," he said gently, "may I speak with you for a moment?" The father returned the nod but kept his posture relaxed, hoping to keep his son calm. "Of course," he replied. The official lowered his voice, taking care not to make the boy uncomfortable. "My name is not important here," he said softly, "but I want to first apologize for what happened earlier. I've already been briefed about the incident involving the pilot." The boy's eyes widened slightly. Earlier, he had been frightened by uniforms and loud voices. Now, an important-looking man was speaking to his dad. He didn't know if this was good or bad. The father simply replied, "Thank you." "We're all right now." The official nodded, though his eyes showed concern. "I understand. Still, this type of situation is not something we take lightly." The boy tugged his father's sleeve and whispered, "Is everything okay?" The father leaned down to him. "Yes, we're just talking. You're safe." The official noticed the boy's anxious expression and softened his tone further. "Hey there," he said gently, crouching slightly so he wasn't towering over the child. "You're not in trouble. You didn't do anything wrong." The boy looked at him carefully. "The pilot was mad," he said quietly. "I know," the official replied. "And I'm sorry he scared you. That shouldn't have happened." The boy nodded but still seemed unsure, after giving the child a reassuring smile. The official stood again and turned to the father. "Sir, could we step a few feet away for privacy? You can bring your son with you, of course." They moved to an area beside the window, where the morning light washed over the rows of chairs. Planes taxied slowly across the tarmac outside, their lights blinking like tiny stars against the brightening sky. The boy watched them while staying close. The official took a careful breath. "The officers told me they recognized you. To be honest, when they radioed in what happened, we were surprised. Your file isn't one we expect to hear in connection with a security call." The father sighed quietly. "I'm aware my name can sometimes cause more reaction than I want. That's why I prefer to stay low profile." "Of course," the official said respectfully. "And please know we're not here to draw attention or disrupt your travel. But since this involved a member of our flight crew, we do need to make sure everything is handled properly." The father gave a simple nod. The boy's attention drifted from the man to the large plane outside. "Is that our plane?" he asked, pointing. The official smiled softly. "Yes, I believe so." "Are we still going on it?" the boy asked. "Absolutely," the official said. "Nothing is stopping you from boarding. You did everything right." The boy relaxed slightly, but the father could see the official wasn't finished. His posture, his careful choice of words, something more was coming. "Sir," the official continued, "I reviewed the security footage from the gate." The father's eyebrows rose slightly, but he wasn't surprised. Modern airports checked everything. The boy didn't know what footage meant. So he simply held his toy plane and listened quietly. "It was exactly as you explained," the official said. "Your son was walking normally. The pilot was standing in an unfortunate position. The bump was small, harmless. Nothing disruptive." "That's good to hear," the father said. The official lowered his voice further. "The pilot reported it as a potential threat. He claimed your son charged at him." As the father exhaled slowly, the boy looked up, confused at the word. "What does charged mean?" he asked. "It means someone runs into someone else on purpose," his father explained gently. "But you didn't do that? You just bumped him by accident." The boy's eyes softened with relief. The official continued. "I also spoke to the officers who responded. They said you remained calm, respectful, and cooperative. They felt the pilot exaggerated the situation." "I'm not looking for trouble," the father said. "I just want my son to feel safe, and he will be," the official said firmly. But then he hesitated, the father noticed. "What is it?" The official glanced gently at the boy to make sure he wasn't scared. "Sir, the pilot is still insisting he acted correctly. He believes he followed protocol. He said he felt threatened." The father gave a quiet, almost tired smile. "By a child?" "I know," the official replied. "It's unexpected, to say the least." The boy fidgeted with the wing of his toy plane. "Is the pilot still angry at us?" "No," his father said quickly. "He's just confused." The boy nodded slowly, accepting that answer. The official took another breath. "Sir, normally we would handle this internally without involving you further. But given who you are, well, your presence means this incident can't simply be brushed aside." The father looked down at his son. The boy was busy watching a tug vehicle pulling luggage carts across the runway. The father asked softly, "Is the pilot going to lose his job?" "Not necessarily," the official said, "but there will be a review. His reactions were inappropriate, especially considering who he directed them at." The father didn't show any anger, only calm thoughtfulness. "I don't want anyone punished harshly," he said. "Just corrected. People forget that small actions can scare a child. He's been through enough already." The official nodded with real respect. "Understood." For a moment, the three of them simply stood together, watching the movement of planes outside. The airport hummed with activity. but the small corner where they stood felt strangely quiet. After a short silence, the official said, "Would you like assistance boarding before general announcement? We can escort you if that would make things easier." The father shook his head gently. "No need for an escort. But if we can board early, that would help my son calm down." "Of course," the official replied. "We'll arrange it." They returned to the seating area, and the official spoke with the gate agent, who nodded quickly and sincerely. She typed something into her computer, then made a call. Meanwhile, the boy leaned against his father. "Dad, is the pilot mad because he thought I heard him?" "Maybe," his father said. "Or maybe he just had a stressful morning." The boy seemed to think about this. "When I get stressed," he said slowly, "you tell me to breathe and be calm." "That's right," his father said. "Maybe someone should tell the pilot that," the boy murmured. The father laughed softly, not loud enough for anyone else to hear. "Maybe." Suddenly, the pilot appeared again near the gate counter, talking to the gate agent. His tone was low, but his stiff body language showed he wasn't pleased. He kept glancing toward the father, his son, as if trying to understand what was happening behind the scenes. Passengers were now whispering. Even though they didn't know the full story, they had seen enough to guess that the pilot had overreacted. The official approached the pilot briefly, though the father couldn't hear what they said. The pilot's expression changed, first confused, then tense, then slightly pale. He stopped speaking and stood very still. The boy noticed. "Dad, why does he look different now?" "People change their faces when they hear something surprising," the father said calmly. The boy tilted his head. "Did he get surprised?" "Maybe," his father said. The pilot remained still, staring ahead blankly. It was clear that he had been told something significant, something he had not expected soon after. The official returned to the father. "Everything's arranged," he said. "When we call pre-boarding, you can come right away. No delays." "Thank you," the father said. The boy squeezed his father's hand. "I just want to sit on the plane and look out the window." "You will," his father said. The official excused himself, giving them space again. Minutes passed. The airport buzzed around them. Suitcases rolled. Phones rang. Kids laughed. Announcements echoed through the speakers. The boy slowly returned to his cheerful state, holding his toy plane above his head. Making soft, whooshing sounds again, the father watched him with quiet relief. Then the gate agent picked up the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "we will begin pre-boarding shortly. If you require extra time or are traveling with young children, please prepare to come forward." "Ready?" "Yes," the boy said brightly, though his voice still carried a shadow of earlier nerves. They walked toward the gate, but before they reached it, the pilot stepped aside quickly. Making room in an overly polite and slightly shaky manner, the father gave a simple nod to him. The pilot opened his mouth as if wanting to say something, but no words came out. The boy looked at him briefly, then looked up at his father. "Is he okay?" "Yes," his father said. "He's thinking." They approached the gate agent, who smiled warmly and scanned their tickets. "You two may board now," she said. The boy lit up. "Thank you." As they walked down the jet bridge, their footsteps echoing softly, the father held his son's hand gently. The boy looked up at him. "Dad, why did everyone get so serious today?" The father took a calm breath. "Sometimes adults forget how to listen. Sometimes they react before they understand. Like when I get upset and you tell me to stop and breathe," the boy asked. "Yes," his father replied. "Should we tell the pilot that?" the boy asked. "Maybe we will," the father said quietly. And as they stepped into the plane cabin, the father knew the hardest part wasn't over yet, because soon the pilot would learn exactly who he had been dealing with. The moment the airport officials arrived near the gate, the air around the small group changed again. The officer who had been talking to the father stepped aside politely, giving space for the officials to approach. They looked calm, but their faces showed that they already understood the weight of the situation. It was clear they weren't called to talk about a simple misunderstanding anymore. Something bigger was unfolding. Even if most people around had no idea what it really was. The father gently held his son's shoulder, keeping him close. The boy's eyes were still slightly red from the stressful moments earlier, but he seemed calmer now. He looked up at his father often, quietly waiting for reassurance. And every time his father gave him a soft, steady look that made him feel safe. The airport's senior operations manager, a polite man with a calm voice, stepped forward and greeted the father respectfully. His tone alone made nearby staff raise their brows. They could feel that this father wasn't just an ordinary traveler. "I'm very sorry for what you've experienced today," the manager said softly. "We want to make sure both you and your son feel comfortable and respected from here on." The father nodded gently. "Thank you. I'm not looking for trouble. I just didn't want my son frightened this way." His voice was steady, not angry, not loud, just honest. The manager gave a small nod, showing he understood the deeper meaning behind those words. A few steps away, the pilot stood stiffly, still trying to maintain the tough, strict stance he had taken earlier. But the moment the manager arrived, he looked uneasy. He sensed something was wrong. He expected the officials to take his side, but when they didn't immediately turn to him, his confidence began fading. Passengers around the gate continued watching, some pretending to scroll on their phones but actually paying full attention to the unfolding drama. A few whispered to each other, wondering why airport authorities were speaking to the father in such a careful, respectful manner. The pilot finally stepped forward and demanded, in a confused and slightly annoyed tone, "Can someone tell me what is happening? I reported a disturbance. This shouldn't take this long." The operations manager turned to him, but before he could speak, one of the officers interrupted with a calm firmness. "We need you to wait a moment." The pilot stared at the officer, stunned. "Wait, I'm the pilot on this flight. My instructions should be taken seriously." The officer didn't raise his voice or show irritation. He simply repeated, "Please wait." This time, the pilot's face tightened. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way. He had assumed everyone would naturally side with him. In his mind, he was the authority in the room. But now the situation was slipping from his hands. He didn't understand why. The operations manager asked the father quietly if they could speak a few steps away from the curious eyes around them. The father agreed and walked with them to a quieter corner near the window, where the early sunlight was spreading across the floor. The boy stayed close, his small hand gripping his father's coat. He looked outside at the parked planes, trying to distract himself from the tension he sensed. Once they were out of earshot from most people, the manager straightened his posture and spoke with even more respect. "We recognize who you are," he said gently, "and we deeply regret what has happened. This shouldn't have happened to anyone, especially not to you and your child." The father sighed softly. "Please don't treat me differently just because of my position," he said. "Treat every family the way you'd want yours to be treated. That's all I ask." The manager lowered his eyes, humbled. "Of course, but we still want to make this right." Behind them, the pilot watched from a distance, growing more anxious by the minute. He saw the officials speaking in low tones to the father, and for the first time since the incident started, he began to worry. Something in their body language told him this was beyond anything he expected. He stepped closer, as if hoping to overhear something, but one of the officers subtly blocked his path. The message was clear. He wasn't invited into this conversation. This only made the pilot more restless. He kept glancing at the father and the officials, trying to guess the reason behind their respectful attitude. Why were they apologizing? Why were they treating him like someone important? He had no idea that the man he'd spoken to so rudely earlier was someone with deep connections in aviation. Someone whose opinion carried serious weight across the industry. Someone who could influence not just a single flight, but the professional future of the pilot himself. While they spoke privately, the boy tugged gently on his father's sleeve. "Are we still going on the plane?" he whispered. "Yes," his father whispered back, giving him a small smile. "Everything will be fine. You didn't do anything wrong." The manager noticed the boy's worried expression and knelt slightly so he could be at eye level. "You're safe," he told him kindly. "I'm sorry you had a scary moment. You've been very brave." The boy nodded, though his eyes stayed unsure. When the private talk ended and the father stepped back toward the main waiting area, the pilot immediately approached him. His tone was suddenly softer, not warm but forced, like someone trying to fix something before it breaks completely. "Sir, look. Maybe we started off on the wrong foot," he said awkwardly. "I just meant to follow protocol. You know how it is. We need to make sure everyone behaves properly near the aircraft." The father listened calmly. "And did you think calling the police on a child was proper?" The pilot opened his mouth, then closed it again. He hadn't expected the father to speak so directly. He shifted uncomfortably. "Well, the situation escalated. I thought he was being disrespectful, and he's a child," the father said quietly. "You spoke to him like he was a criminal." The pilot swallowed hard. The father's tone wasn't angry. In fact, it was the calmness that made the words sharper. The operations manager stepped in before the pilot could respond. "Captain," he said firmly, "I need a word with you. Now." His voice made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. The pilot followed him a few steps away. Their conversation was quiet, but the pilot's expression revealed everything. At first he looked confused, then shocked, then scared. His eyes widened, and he took a step back as if he needed air. It became clear in that moment that he had just learned the father's true identity. The father pretended not to notice the shift. But the pilot's entire body language changed. His shoulders lowered, his face dropped. And he looked like someone who had just realized he might lose something very important. Passengers nearby noticed the change instantly. Some whispered things like, "Why does he suddenly look so nervous?" Others kept watching with growing curiosity. After the quiet conversation, manager returned to the father and spoke respectfully. "We assure you this matter will not be brushed aside. We will handle it properly." "I don't want him punished harshly," the father said. "Just trained better. No family should feel the stress we just felt." The manager nodded gratefully. "You're very generous to say that." The boy tugged on his father's sleeve again. "Can we just go on the plane now?" "Yes," the father said softly. "Let's get you settled." Airport staff escorted them gently toward the boarding door, making sure they moved without any more interruptions. Even passengers stepped aside, giving them more space than usual. The pilot approached again, looking pale and uncertain. He forced a small smile and said, "Sir, I want to apologize, truly. I didn't know. I shouldn't have acted that way." The father met his eyes calmly. "Treat everyone with respect," he said. "Not just the ones you think are important." The pilot nodded, unable to find the right words. As the father and his son walked down the jet bridge, the tension behind them slowly faded. The people at the gate were left with whispers, questions, and a quiet sense that something very unusual had happened. The father didn't look back. He simply held his son's hand and walked forward, hoping the rest of the journey would be peaceful. But for the pilot, the walk back to the front of the gate felt heavier than ever. His mistake wasn't just a small misunderstanding anymore. It had become a lesson he would remember for the rest of his career. The truth about who he had confronted had changed everything, and deep down, he knew that the consequences, whatever they might be, were only just beginning. The jet bridge felt quieter than the rest of the airport as the father and his son walked toward the plane. The boy held his father's hand tightly, still a little nervous from everything that had happened. The father gave him a gentle smile now and then, wishing he could erase the fear from the child's mind completely. He knew the journey should have been simple, just a normal flight, a normal day. But instead, it had turned into something heavier, something that neither of them would forget. When they stepped inside the aircraft, flight attendants greeted them with warm smiles. Their voices were soft, almost apologetic, without saying any actual words. They had already been told what happened at the gate, and the moment they saw the father, they adjusted their tone. They didn't want the boy to feel scared or unwelcome. "Welcome aboard," one of the attendants said kindly. "If you need anything at all, please let us know." The boy nodded, still unsure, but her smile seemed to help a little. The father thanked her politely, guiding his son toward their seats. The boy pressed his face against the window immediately. Finding a small distraction in watching the workers outside prepare the aircraft, the father took his own seat and let out a long breath, feeling some of the tension drain from his shoulders. A few minutes later, passengers began boarding behind them. Some recognized the pair from the earlier incident and whispered among themselves. But the father stayed calm, pretending not to hear. He didn't want his son to focus on any of it. Before the cabin door closed, the pilot appeared at the front of the plane. His face was still tight with worry. This time, he didn't show the strong, commanding presence he had earlier. Instead, he looked hesitant, almost unsure of himself. He approached the father slowly, standing near the edge of their row. "Sir," he said quietly, "I wanted to say sorry again. I truly didn't mean to cause trouble for you or your son." The father looked up at him. He could see that the pilot's apology wasn't just polite, it was sincere. The pilot looked like someone who had spent the last hour replaying his actions over and over, realizing how wrong he had been. "It's fine," the father said gently. "Just remember that what you say and how you say it matters, especially when you're speaking to families or children." The pilot nodded slowly. "I understand, and I'll do better." There was a quiet moment between them before the father added, "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them." The pilot bowed his head and stepped back. There were no excuses this time, no explanations, just sincerity. Then he walked back to the front and prepared for takeoff. When the plane finally lifted into the sky, the boy looked out the window in wonder, his earlier fear slowly melting away. The sunlight bounced off the clouds, creating soft golden reflections that made the sky look peaceful. The father watched him quietly, feeling grateful that his son was recovering from the stressful morning. The rest of the flight was calm. Flight attendants checked on them more often than usual, always polite but not overwhelming. They offered the boy extra juice, a snack, and even a small set of headphones. The boy smiled shyly each time, slowly finding comfort again. At one point, a flight attendant leaned close to the father and whispered, "We're really sorry about everything earlier. We hope the rest of your experience is peaceful." Father nodded with appreciation. "Thank you. You've been very kind." The attendant smiled and moved on, relieved, about halfway through the flight. The boy leaned against his father's arm and whispered, "Are people always that strict at airports?" The father took a moment before answering. "Not always," he said softly. "Sometimes people forget to be patient, or they get stressed and say things they don't mean. But most people try their best." The boy nodded thoughtfully. "I didn't mean to bump into him. I was just excited." "I know," his father said. "And you didn't do anything wrong?" The boy's small smile returned, and he rested his head against the seat. After landing, the passengers filed out of the plane slowly. Many glanced at the father with a mix of curiosity and respect, still unsure of what had actually happened. But no one approached him or his son. They simply stepped aside, giving them space. At the aircraft door, the pilot stood waiting. His posture was straight, but his eyes held a seriousness that hadn't been there earlier in the day. "Thank you for flying with us," he said softly. When they reached the exit, the father paused for a moment. "Take care," he replied. The pilot nodded, grateful for those two simple words. Once they walked into the terminal, the atmosphere felt lighter. It was busy and full of movement, but nothing felt threatening anymore. The boy held on to his father's hand but didn't squeeze it as tightly this time. They made their way through the airport calmly. The father could feel the weight of the earlier hours slowly lifting off his shoulders, although he knew there were still things that would happen behind the scenes. Far behind them, outside the father's view, airport officials gathered for a follow-up conversation. They discussed the pilot's behavior, the seriousness of the incident, and what steps needed to be taken. They agreed that the pilot needed additional training in how to communicate and handle sensitive situations. They made it clear that his status as a captain didn't excuse him from learning how to treat passengers with respect and patience. They also made sure a written apology would be sent to the father, not because of his identity, but because it was the right thing to do. The father, meanwhile, wasn't thinking about any of that. He simply walked with his son toward the baggage area, wanting the day to feel normal again. When they sat on a bench waiting for their luggage, the boy leaned against him and asked, "Will that man get in big trouble?" The father shook his head gently. "I don't want him to be in big trouble. I just want him to learn to be kinder next time. That's enough." The boy seemed relieved by that answer. He didn't like the idea of anyone getting in trouble because of him. "You're kind," the boy whispered. The father smiled and wrapped an arm around him. "Kindness is the best way to fix most things, even when people make mistakes." The boy nodded and looked around the busy hall. He seemed calmer now, almost back to his cheerful self. When their luggage finally arrived, they picked it up and headed toward the exit. As they walked out into the fresh air outside the terminal, the father felt a sense of closure. The day had been long and stressful, but they had made it through without anger, without shouting, without creating a scene. He believed firmly that dignity didn't come from titles or authority, it came from how one treated others. That belief guided him through the entire situation, and it was the reason he didn't let the moment turn into something bigger or uglier for the pilot. However, the day stayed with him long after the passengers had left. He sat alone in the quiet cockpit later, replaying everything that happened. He felt embarrassed, ashamed, and disappointed in himself. He knew he should have been more patient, more understanding. He also knew that he had been given a chance to reflect and improve, instead of being punished harshly. That chance came from the same man he had treated unfairly, the pilot decided, right then and there, that he would change how he handled such moments in the future. He would slow down. He would listen more. He would remember that the uniforms people wear don't define their worth. He promised himself he would treat every passenger with respect from that day forward. Meanwhile, the father and his son stepped into a waiting car outside the airport. The boy looked out the window, watching planes take off and land in the distance. "Next time," the boy said softly, "I'll be more careful when I walk." The father smiled. "And next time, the adults around you will hopefully be more careful with their words." The boy giggled a little, and the father gently ruffled his hair. They drove away peacefully, leaving the long morning behind them. There were no arguments, no shouting, no anger lingering in the air, just a lesson learned, a moment of growth, and a reminder that kindness could change the direction of a day in the end. The father didn't need recognition or special treatment. What he wanted more than anything was for people to remember compassion, and for the pilot, that lesson would shape not only his career, but his future interactions with every person who ever stepped onto his aircraft. A mistake had been made. A lesson had been learned. And life moved forward quietly, calmly, and with a little more understanding than before.